we've got a very exciting day ahead of us, lots of interesting discussions and debates. You should have on your chairs the program and an evaluation form which we'd like you to fill in before you leave. And also some biographical details of the speakers in the plenary sessions this morning. This year marks the 21st anniversary of CAWN. We grew out of the British Solidarity and Human Rights Committees, which were supporting the struggles of the people in Central America at the time of civil war and revolution, and also at the time when women's organizations were coming together and fighting for women's rights. Our aim is to disseminate information about the situation of women's rights in Central America and in Mexico, to carry out research and to undertake joint projects with women's organizations. Over the years, we have implemented a number of projects addressing women's economic rights and violence against women. We also carry out international advocacy and support our partners to influence debates on development and women's rights. We consider it important for women's voices from the regions to be heard in the UK by different audiences, and we invite women from the region to present their situation, their demands and their struggles. At the conference today, we have several young women from Central America, from the Centro de Estudios de la Mujer, from Honduras, from the Movimiento María Elena Cuadras and Puntos de Encuentro in Nicaragua. We brought them over this week to participate in a training on using the media for campaigning on women's rights. We also invited representatives from a South African women's organization, Mazimayani, who have participated in the training and who will be running one of the workshops this afternoon on trafficking in South Africa. The media training and today's conference are part of our development education project on women's rights, social inclusion and the media that CAWN is running together with Frau Solidaridad, an Austrian women's organization that specializes on the media and development, who are also with us today and will be sharing their many years of experience of working on alternative radio and the media and development. The 25 participants of the media training are young women activists who will be writing blogs and articles about the conference, and so be warned, they might be approaching you for an interview during the breaks today. Sent home for their survival. However, government authority profits of millions of pounds for the traffickers, but the available data vary widely and it's different in the region. In Central America, research by the International Office on Migration, what you're saying. In terms of the fire drill, if we hear the fire, we have to mute, and they are therefore receiving interpretation at the back. CAWN has been focusing on labor exploitation of migrant women and trafficking as forms of violence against women, as well as the role of the media in portraying positive and negative images of women. And we hope that the wide variety of speakers we have today will cover all the different and challenging aspects of these different topics. Now, Central America is one of the poorest and most violent regions in the world, and throughout Latin America as a whole, there is an alarming increase in the extreme forms of violence and violation of women's human rights. And governments in the region lack the capacity or the political will to guarantee women's rights and safety. In Central America especially, the trafficking of women for commercial sexual exploitation is linked to organized crime.
Human trafficking is the second biggest money maker in the black market industry around the world. All the economists in the world now accept this, including the World Bank, including universities. Everybody who's an economist and globally accepts this. The first that comes is arms, then human trafficking, and then drugs. The reason that human trafficking comes second now is you can use a person more than once, where a drug you can only use once. And I think people need to remember that very clearly. It is an industry on cash only. It's a cash only business. Middle management around human trafficking is women, unfortunately. And quite often the middle management are women who have been trafficked and is persuaded by the trafficker, bigger management, to go into this business. Also, the banks, although they have, and globally banks, I just don't mean our country or your country, but globally, the banks and the World Bank is very aware of the cash side of human trafficking, and they have been trying to implement the money laundering rules around the world. But still, there seems to be a problem about that. I think it's a problem of closing your eyes and not looking at suitcases of money when it comes in. And also, the World Bank have an extremely good official who worked in law and now works with them as a consultant, but was working with them full-time. But at the World Bank, you have to retire at 63, called Ted Greenberg, who spent a lot of his time going to parts of Eastern Europe, parts of South America, and parts of other the world to try to talk both with the governments and with the banks in those countries about money laundering, about coming forward, about clients who come in with large sums of money and who are banking large sums of money on a regular basis. Coming on to human trafficking itself, human trafficking is defined really by anybody, whoever it is, male or female, however old it is, who has their passport and freedom taken away from them, and where they are moved around. It's really like old slave days. The person becomes enslaved. Human trafficking affects both male and female. Today, globally, it is almost 50-50. There was a time when it was really just women, but more and more men are involved and taken to be part of, conned into being trafficked into bonded labour, and I'll come to that just now. But if you look at the parts that human trafficking comes together, there is women who are trafficked, as we know, which we will talk about later, for the sex trade. And it's not just women, it's young girls. It is people who are taken to work in the fisheries. There is big cases going on now with the New Zealand and Australian government where young men are being taken to work in the fisheries, taken way out into the water to fish and live on the boats and have no freedom whatsoever.
And data about the extent of trafficking of women from Latin America to Europe.
Young babies are taken where people desperately want to have a child. They can't have a child. They find it difficult to wait, as we understand, through all the adoption procedures, whether it's in this country or in anywhere else. So it's easier to move home, find out where somebody is having a baby, may not want this baby, and they just take the baby. They don't even go through the paperwork. They just take the baby, it goes across borders, they pretend it's their baby, there's no papers, and this child is brought up as their baby, although they say it's adopted. But I think my friend from the ILO will confirm that there is more of this going on in the world than was originally known, and more because, understandably, families and couples want to have a child. And because of the whole problem of fostering and adoption rules around the world makes it very difficult. Coming away from, I'll come on to the reports and things in just a minute, but you know, border control, I know in our country, which we're going to talk a bit about in a moment, in a lot of the countries around the world is not very stringent. So I'll come on then to the different conventions. There is the Palermo Convention, which was the first convention, I think, on human trafficking, which came into play in the late 90s when UN GIFT was set up. And I first came across the Palermo Convention in 1998 in New York, in the United Nations, when the first office for UN GIFT was formally set up. And I went to a meeting because I was persuaded that this was an issue, that I needed to be involved, only to find out that my own government, the United Kingdom, had not even signed up to the Palermo Convention, and then when we got them to sign up, we had to get them to ratify. And one of the things, I know you're doing other workshops today, But when a country signs up and ratifies, that's not the end. That's really the beginning. The campaign to make your government sign up to some international treaties is only the start. You then have to ensure, and I would duplicate the training, that you'd have to take them on then, every step of the way, every day of the week, to ensure that they're continuing to be pressed on to make sure this is happening. Because the moment the pressure is off, they slip back. The money's transferred somewhere else unless you're watching it and so on. But then, a little while later, after the Palermo Convention, which is fairly good, but it is weak, is the European Convention on Human Trafficking, set up by the Council of Europe, signed now by over 47 countries and other global countries, as other countries globally are signing up. This is a much stronger convention. It's been strengthened recently, and this government, after a lot of arguing, signed up, not because they didn't want to sign it. It was about an issue about Europe, but they did sign it after some pressure, because it strengthens it not only with the European Convention, but you can prosecute cross-border, which you can't under the Palermo Convention. Also, you can recover money cross-border, wherever that might be. And UNICEF has worked very hard on this convention and getting this convention together. How do we try to monitor governments around the world where they, in some respects, but a lot of governments, as the chair has just said, close their eyes to human trafficking. They absolutely close their eyes because to them, it suits them for these people and children to leave the country because it's less burden for them to worry about. And they know what's happening. In particular, in the stans, Kurdistan and Azerbaijan and those countries, which are not only they're through countries where people come through to go to other destination, but also they're now becoming destination countries for men and for women because they're doing huge amount of construction in those countries, and there's also the oil and gas businesses. Further, the real problem in Eastern Europe is that there isn't enough employment for young women, and they are taken away, sex trafficked, and myself and others challenged some of the ambassadors, some of the women ambassadors, about this in UN last year, and they were sort of very iffy about it, and were not in the way we had expected them to take this. And one of them turned around to me, I had a witness who really fell off the chair when she said, well, we can't help it that we have such pretty girls. You know, I mean, you just wanted to you know, you have to be terribly calm. This was not the place to. Points of entries to countries across borders are very easy to take people through. A number of airlines coming into the UK and Delta Airlines itself globally have signed an informal convention around what is known as the Athens Agreement, which was set up by End Human Trafficking now in Athens about 6 years ago, getting countries to look at their supply chain. But also Delta not only wanted to look at their supply chain of people, how things are made, where it comes from, they also wanted to sign up to a convention of doing their best, not only not to have anybody working with them who's trafficked or supplying food or whatever, also to say we don't want to be involved in anything to do with trafficking. And they have signed the Athens Agreement and say we're looking at ourselves all the time. All airlines coming into Europe now, and particularly into the UK and so on, all have signed an agreement that they will look very carefully, and they will be talking about that if they allow somebody to travel who's an immigrant, or legal immigrant, or somebody who's being trafficked, then they can be fined very heavily. So they'll be questioned if you see the same woman or man coming every couple of weeks with some children or with some young people who they're not talking to, and all of that. But what we have a very weak link here is with Eurostar. Eurostar has not signed or never been asked. I'm trying to pressurize the government in one way or another, and maybe with Eurostar. But they have not signed up or were not asked to sign the same agreement as the airlines have signed. So if people come in through Eurostar, or illegal, who are human trafficked, or well then the border controls just have to deal with it. And that's not the same as Eurostar being responsible for people who travel on their train. And we have to sort of start putting pressure on them to look at people who are huddled together, young girls who are traveling with two guys, you know, children who are with the same woman, again using the example I used before, because a lot happens. There's a weak link at Lille, there's a weak link in Disneyland, there's a very weak link both in Paris and Brussels, because you can change trains there to go to anywhere else in Europe. You know, you can go, the trains go everywhere. So there's a weak link coming in, and also a weak link going out, because once somebody's on one of those trains, they just keep moving along, or being moved along. So Eurostar is a weak link to Europe.
If you were to work with a very broad definition of trafficking as the movement and holding of people against their will for purposes of exploitation, I actually don't see why we shouldn't describe that as human trafficking. But it's not what people normally have in mind. More likely, I think people would be thinking of a case like that of Gavril Dulgero, a Moldavian who was living in London, who was convicted in 2005 for conspiring to facilitate illegal immigration, for a range of other offences, and for trafficking, for prostitution and sexual exploitation. And the women that he exploited worked 20-hour shifts in brothels in Park Lane, Mayfair and Soho. They were fed only one meal a day. They worked in appalling conditions. And a news report from the time speaks about one victim, says, like many trafficking victims, the computer graduate was lured to Britain by promises of respectable, well-paid job in a hotel or restaurant, but ended up in a brothel. And she talks about how she believed that her family would be killed, that she was confined, locked up, and so on. And this case, along with many others like it, does demonstrate the fact that the sex sector in the UK is a site in which people can be subject to very serious forms of exploitation and abuse. And it's also a case that conforms very closely to popular understandings of trafficking as modern slavery. And for over a decade, there's been what you could describe as a discourse that's emerged as people talk about trafficking, and one of the key things that people say is that it's taking place everywhere and on a vast scale, that it's a $7 billion a year industry and so on. And the other is to describe it as modern slavery. So Antonio Maria Costa, head of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime at a conference in 2008, he said, 200 years after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, we have the obligation to fight a crime that has no place in the 21st century. Let's call it what it is, modern slavery. And obviously the idea of fighting the modern equivalent of the transatlantic slave trade has enormous popular appeal and moral purchase, because after all, who's in favour of slavery? And who doesn't feel a sort of a surge of righteous emotion if they're called upon to help free the slaves? So in a way, constructing it like this is a very comfortable invitation to everybody to join together to condemn something that we can all agree is wrong. But I think that this only works by detaching the issue of trafficking from problems that migrants face more generally, detaching those from their political context and presenting them as though they're simply the outcome of individual morality or criminality. So the focus is on men like Gavril Dulgero, and it's not on the way that governments, by their actions and by their inactions through their policies on things like immigration, their policies on welfare, their policies on employment, and of course for this conference, crucially, their policies on prostitution. The focus isn't on that and how those policies might actually make some people vulnerable to abuse and exploitation that they would not otherwise be vulnerable to. So I want to just draw attention to some ways that trafficking is not like critically. If you think about the transatlantic slave trade, the most obvious difference is that the Africans who between the 15th and 19th centuries were forcibly transported to the Americas did not have a pre-existing ambition or desire to move there. Whereas the people who are currently described as victims of trafficking almost invariably, sometimes not, but almost invariably wanted to move to another region or country, and almost invariably they had excellent reasons for wanting to move. Like the computer graduate in the Dalgiru case, most people who end up in exploitative and violent situations had initially decided to migrate. And that could be because they believed that their life chances and earning opportunities would be greatly improved through migration, or it could be in the context of far more acute and desperate forms of human insecurity. But either way, whatever the reason for choosing to migrate, that decision is made in the context of immigration regimes that have become increasingly restrictive over the last 2 decades. And the tightening of border controls and the clamping down on opportunities for legal and safe migration are linked to a massive growth in the market for clandestine migration services. And the research literature on irregular migration shows that it can involve a number of different forms of debt and dependency, and that as a result, some irregular migrants do end up being subject to an array of violent, coercive and exploitative practices, both in the course of travel and at the point of destination. But it's also important to remember their experience is not necessarily one of exploitation and abuse. Some irregular migrants are helped by people who don't cheat them or harm them in any way. And even where it is linked to abuse and exploitation, that experience is along a continuum. It's not a simple either you've been enslaved and brutalised or you're totally free and everything's hunky-dory. And that actually connects to another crucial difference between the transatlantic slave trade and trafficking, which is that those who were historically transported from Africa to the Americas were moved into societies where slavery was one of the established and recognised statuses that were used to define employment relations. So a slave was readily identifiable in the sense that they were legally defined as such. So you can talk about slaves from the 15th to 19th centuries as a specific bounded group and know who you're talking about. Today, of course, people are not being transported into societies where slavery is legally recognised and regulated as a juridical category. Trafficked people are not people who have been formally assigned the legal status of a slave. Yes, victim of trafficking does exist as an administrative category in a number of states, but this is a status which is assigned to those migrants who the authorities look at and think, yes, you pass the test, you are a victim of trafficking. And obviously if anti-trafficking campaigners were to focus just on people who have been awarded that status, victim of trafficking, then the numbers involved would be so small as to make any comparison with the transatlantic slave trade look ridiculous. In fact, the United States, for instance, between 2000 and 2007, despite the government putting out estimates that over 50,000 people per year were trafficked into the country, they only actually recognised 1,362 people as being sufficiently victimised to deserve any rights or protections. Who counts as a victim of trafficking and on what basis remains very contentious. Take migrants' involvement in prostitution. Again, the research literature shows you that practices of people who recruit and transport migrants for prostitution or who organise prostitution span a spectrum. and it runs from what is, in effect, just pure brutal thuggery, right through to perfectly mainstream business practice or even ethical principles. So those two extremes can even exist side by side. You might find that there's a man like the Dalgiru in that initial case, operating a flat in Mayfair, and right next door to him there's a flat that's operated by a woman who is actually quite committed to equality and the welfare of the other women who work there. So that means that in prostitution, as in other sectors, the abuse that migrants might be experiencing runs along a continuum. It's not a simple either-or. And so at what point do we say the abuse, the exploitation was so severe that we're going to call this trafficking? And there's a temporal as well as a political problem with this. There are a large number of Nigerian women working in street prostitution in Italy under the control of a madam to whom they are massively indebted for the costs of their migration. And there are a lot of documented cases of extremely violent, sometimes murderous acts committed against these women or against their families back home by the people who they're indebted to. So you might think that if you wanted to work with a distinction between smuggled people and trafficked victims, that just looking at that degree of violence would help you to draw the line. But actually, the same research on women, Nigerian women in prostitution in Italy, shows that violence isn't a universal or a consistent feature of their experience. That actually the level of violence and intimidation decreases over time, and that more importantly, the debt is actually worked off after between 1 and 3 years, and at that point, women are free from control of their madam. So it's more about a situation where you've got loans that have been given for unauthorised migration, which, as you can imagine, are extremely risky. And so you've got people then deciding the only way they can ensure that they get repaid is by using extremely coercive methods. And Patrizia Testai, who's done really interesting research on this, draws attention to another crucially important point, which is that although Nigerian migrant sex workers are often referred to by others as being sex slaves or victims of trafficking, they don't always see themselves in the same light. And her interviewees actually expressed a mix of feelings towards the people who had arranged their migration. And there's a quote from one woman that she interviewed who says, "The madam charges us too much money. All of them charge you a lot of money. But it's good that they brought us here. They helped us in a way. They are second to Jesus Christ."
Actually overlap and we cannot draw a straight line. It has even the
victim's commitment to the pact makes it particularly difficult to combat this form of trafficking. And I think there you have it in a nutshell. How can the idea that trafficking is modern slavery be reconciled with acknowledgement of any reciprocity in the relationship between the slaver and the enslaved? And yet, if you then say, okay, no, these women are smuggled, not trafficked, you would be then accepting that smuggled people can be subject to exploitation that's just as violent and just as brutal as that which is normally considered to be the fate of victims of trafficking. And this highlights a real problem with the distinction between smuggling and trafficking that's based on an assumed split between coerced migration as though that's clean cut, that's one thing over there, and then voluntary migration as though that's clean cut too and something else over here. And of course lots of trafficking activists, anti-trafficking activists, have done really important work to try to ensure that the focus is on the forced labour or the slavery-like outcomes of trafficking. And you know, the European Convention that's been mentioned, that is very much along those lines. But in practice, and this is based on research that we did with police officers and immigration officers in London several years ago, in practice, the people who come into contact with migrants who've been subject to forced labour, they continue to distinguish between the deserving victim of trafficking, who is considered to have just been coerced straightforwardly into movement, and the undeserving illegal immigrant or smuggled person who invited their own fate. And the people who come into contact with victims also have to make distinctions or judgments about how bad the situation is of the person they found. So if you think about, you know, and decide, is this just a very unlucky victim, an unlucky illegal immigrant who's being exploited, or are they actually being treated so badly that they're going to count as a slave? And that's obviously very difficult in relation to prostitution, where there's no agreements even about minimum labour standards or employment relations and so on. So you think about that Dalgiru case and wonder, well, if those women had not actually been locked into the building, or if there had not actually been threats against them, but they'd still been forced to work in such harsh conditions, and there was still a demand that they repaid their debts, their migration debts, would they still have counted as victims of trafficking? And there are some people who would argue very strongly, yes, of course they would. But there are also the officials who are involved in counting and classifying victims, and they would almost certainly say no, because in theory, so long as they're not actually locked in or actually have death threats against them or their family, they can walk away.
Good morning, my name is Rani Bilku. I'm from an organisation called GINA International. I have 2.5 questions for Baroness Mordi. Inspiring to listen to you. I've been reading your blogs for some time. My first question, and also just an observation in terms of wanting babies, in terms of trafficking. Also, babies are a great commodity coming to this country. They are often used to get benefits, etc. So they are also bought as well. And the other definition in terms of trafficking and passports taken away. Now, whilst I acknowledge that this is an international conference regarding trafficking, I also want to acknowledge the fact in this room that there is grooming internally going on in countries as well that needs to be addressed. Forget the political correctness, and over the last couple of years we've seen very specific groups being targeted. And secondly, regarding spousal visas, women who are usually more vulnerable coming into the countries, from the developing countries to the developed countries, they don't know their rights, and they are then used for domestic servitude and other sort of work in terms of sex work, etc.
I look on the other part of human trafficking is where babies are taken because people desperately want a child, and then to bring up somebody and to love them. So I know the benefit point, but it's the other thing. On the whole question, I agree with you on the whole question of people's passports taken away, and they're afraid to go to the police because they don't have a passport. In this country, where embassies, and we know we've had publicity, and the police are really watching embassies, and the Foreign Office have really had to go, where embassies have actually brought in people themselves and taken somebody's passport away, and they're working in the embassy in a slave way, both doing domestic work and other works. The British government actually have taken prosecutions against the country who has done this, and the ambassadors. We're one of the first countries really to start doing that. America has not done it because they're afraid of oil being cut off and so on, but we are trying to put pressure on them because they are. The other thing, just aside to this, that women who come in as domestic workers, and you all know a number of them around this country, they sometimes take loans, and it's from their own country people, and the country people take their passports away from them, and it's absolutely illegal every way to take somebody's passport away for money or for anything else. And I think it's a really important message to get out there, that you should never give your passport as collateral on the basis that you will pay that money back, because also their passports will be sold on to somebody else. And I agree with you that we have to get some form of video or some message to people. It can't be a leaflet because they get thrown away.
I really thought Julia's raised some very important issues. And I wanted to ask about whether there's any research been done on looking at the links between government policies and the degree of bad forms of trafficking in countries, given that you make a link, let's say, between lack of benefits, immigration policies and so on, whether when there's a change in policies that also leads to increases. If any research has been done on that.
I just wanted to ask about legalisation of prostitution and how that might affect how migrants experience their work in the informal, well, in their work here in the UK. It's difficult because they're lying on display.
The women who they've been interviewing had a good idea of what they were getting themselves into when they decided to migrate in those ways, and that in their estimation, this isn't a question of whether in absolute terms we should regard, but in their estimation, there was a reciprocity, even though they might be unhappy with other elements of it. There were bits of it that they regarded as reciprocal, and that they regarded themselves as having, getting something from this arrangement, that they wanted to end up in Italy, and that was the only way that they could see that could possibly happen.
Most Latin American countries have laws against human trafficking and have ratified the UN protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking. There isn't much evidence or programs to implement this legislation. There are many studies.
Yeah, what I'm going to cover today is European anti-trafficking campaigns done by one single organization that's called International Organization for Migration, IOM. For those working on issues of trafficking or issues of migration of any kind, you have probably heard of this organization because it's the most important organization globally when it comes to migration management. Next to the anti-trafficking campaigns, they do labor migration, detentions, deportations, return programs, visa issues, technologies, everything you can think of when it comes to issues of migration. What I want to discuss, I have looked into 10 or 12 of their campaigns, and there is an article that has been published in 2007 in Feminist Review that you can download full access on Feminist Review website. So if you're interested in the article, please go and download it. It's for free and it's open access. I'm going to cover only two campaigns just to give you an idea around two issues. The first issue is problems with representation in anti-trafficking campaigns. And the second one is the production of meaning in anti-trafficking campaigns, how images of victims are produced in these campaigns. Okay? I'm going to start with a campaign in the Baltic states in 2002. And I'm going to start with this campaign because it has been the most discussed and the most problematic of IOM campaigns. And why is this so? This is because of the type of images they have used in the campaign. And I'm going to start with two of these images and show them to you. Okay. I'm also going to start with two quotes, and these are quotes because I thought there has been quite a serious debate around this campaign. And this is the response of the person responsible within the IOM for the campaign after she has been criticized by Anne Jordan and feminist NGOs about representation of women in the campaigns. So she's explaining why they have decided to go with this type of image, and she says, in the particular case you have mentioned, that of women hanging by hooks, there was reasoning behind the use of such images. The nakedness was meant to show the helplessness and vulnerability of trafficked women. The hooks were visual metaphors used to convey an essential aspect of trafficking, namely the manipulation and exploitation to which trafficked women are subjected. I want to read you a second quote as well. And she says, no, women are not objects or puppets, as you rightly point out. Nor are nudity and sexuality used for their own sake, although they are part of the trafficking equation. But most trafficked women find themselves treated as slaves with no control of their lives whatsoever. This is the idea we wanted to convey. There cannot be too much talk of choice or empowerment when you are sold, beaten, raped, or killed. Okay. So I have read you these two quotes because I think it's really interesting and show you the images to think what is actually happening and what kind of reasoning is behind these campaigns. Yeah. This is just a quote from where it is. So whenever you post something, just be careful because it will go everywhere. Yeah, like everyone will be reading it. Nothing is private with the social media anymore. Into these categories, but it means that most of the research shows that these categories overlap. So when it comes to this is about the authentic representation of trafficking, of experiences, and that what they are representing is actually the truth and the reality of women's experience. Okay, these are the key ideas that feed into those answers and into this campaign. So what we can then say is that the image of the woman that we're going to call the puppet, the representation of the body, is actually, the assumption is that there is a straightforward relationship between the reality of women's experiences and how that reality is represented. Like, okay, so if this is what women experience, then we're going to represent it exactly in this way. Okay, that is a straightforward relationship. But that is a problematic assumption, and it has unintended effects, and I'm going to discuss those with you. Okay. What is the problem with this type of reasoning that links experience and representation in a straightforward way? And this is that it is really problematic, like seriously, to collapse the experience of women with visual images of women, okay? Because, and I'm here building, I'm not going to go into it as an academic, I have simplified this as much as I can, but I'm going to try to kind of convey all the same. And this is that there is a basic and fundamental difference between how women as representation, and this is why that women, that is with a capital W, and women as social beings, okay? And like real women and their experiences. Woman as representation is like, has to be understood within the way we actually conceive of the social world and of the binaries that sustain the way we see the world and in which the world is organized. And those binaries is like, you'll be aware of this, it's much between men and women, and then where men stand for like the universal and women's experience stands that one is a specific, okay? So we have a subject on the one hand and women being conceived as objects. So there is what is at the base of this organization of social relations, which is more on the symbolic level, is a very dualistic organization of how we think of the world and of the others. What this means is that in this relationship, in this dualistic relationship, women always stay positioned as the other, okay? And the other is not just a neutral term. The other is always represented in terms of the negative, okay? So think this, we can translate back to the issues of public and private, okay? We can translate it back to the reason that is associated with men and emotions and body that is associated with women, okay? So when someone tells you, oh, you're being hysteric, that's your word, it's not a neutral statement, right? It is a negative one. And it is negative exactly because women are not linked to reason, but they are linked to the emotions of the body. Voluntary migration on the one hand, and forced migration on the other, showing immigration regulations and labor regulations. Okay? I'm going to go back to two of this, so just don't worry, I'll bring the images back.
The categories of migrant women working in the UK sex trade and victims of sex trafficking are collapsed into one without any word of explanation. In fact, it is unknown how many of these women have been forced into prostitution. It is unlikely to be 100%. Berman points out that constructing all migrant Eastern European sex workers as a group of innocents in need of protection of, but also deportation from, the state, means these discourses work to affirm the place of the state in maintaining sovereign borders and quelling the anxiety created by European integration and globalization. However, For the moral panic over the brutal sexual exploitation of women to coexist with a reasonably tolerant attitude to prostitution and a fear of overwhelming immigration, cultural representation in the UK press must go to extraordinary lengths to establish distinctions and to make the representational system cohere, such as the difference between innocent and guilty women working in prostitution and legitimate and illegitimate foreign bodies. Okay. The widespread use of the white slavery myth, and the way it feeds into, is problematic, partly because of the way it feeds into anti-trafficking legislation, which focuses strongly on returning trafficked women and illegal immigrants to their countries of origin and not on protecting them. In effect, this criminalises much of women's migration, and tighter border controls actually increase the likelihood that women will be trafficked and exploited. If the official routes are closed, then women and men will use illegal channels to cross international borders. The white slavery myth in sex trafficking discourses becomes a way to justify anti-immigration policies. By conjuring a moral panic based on a discourse of innocence, border violations and kidnap, the media, the government and the police in the UK fail to engage with the risks and problems surrounding domestic prostitution. This means that women working in prostitution continue to be failed by a state that does not offer them protection. Other representational problems include the perpetuation of the age-old Madonna-whore dichotomy, in which innocent girls need protecting and bad women who choose prostitution deserve all they get. Accusing the media of hypocrisy is hardly original or effective, but their important awareness-raising function around human trafficking is seriously undermined through the titillating descriptions of violence, which are commonplace in the tabloid press. Needless voyeuristic erotic detail, such as a pimp ordering a girl to reveal her 34C boobs, or the description of lingerie-clad Francesca watching with dread as the man took off his clothes, occurring in the same breath as contempt for the punters who make use of these women makes for especially queasy reading. The readers derive a sexual frisson from the situation, but can remain morally superior to the men who actually went out and bought the woman's body. Trafficking victims embody the erotic, pathetic, and the vividly drawn abuse scenario has many superficial similarities with common fetishised power play of slave and master, not to mention extreme versions of traditional gender relations. Titillating coverage of real abuse blurs the lines between reality and fantasy. This is especially dangerous given that a proportion of the readership will visit prostitutes and may well encounter women who have been trafficked. The ubiquitous use of the phrase sex slave in the media to describe women who've been trafficked for sexual exploitation, and 72% of the articles in my sample contained it, has the effect of trivialising the issue. The phrase is common in pornography, but it is also used frequently in mainstream culture as a code for something a bit kinky or a bit naughty. It has more associations for the general public with the fluffy handcuffs that can be bought in any gift shop than with prostitution or bonded labour. In October 2005, 19 women were rescued from a prison-like brothel, most of whom were Eastern European. This story generated a total of 4,047 words of new coverage in the newspapers I looked at. In May 2006, another 19 women were rescued in the same way from similar conditions, but these women were all from Malaysia, and this story received just 739 words of coverage. The more the myth of white slavery is repeated, the more fixed it becomes in the minds of the readership. And because of its tone of moral outrage and proclaimed objective of protecting women, it becomes difficult to criticise. Deviating from the standard narrative or questioning its validity can lead to accusations ranging from misogyny to ignorance to unpatriotic beliefs. A quote I just wanted to end on. The quote behind me from Wendy Chapkis forms an apt conclusion to my research, especially as she recognises that sex trafficking discourses bring together feminist and right-wing campaigners on unstable ground. As a feminist, I think it is important to critically evaluate the representation of sex trafficking and how it is used, and balance the need for emotional impact with further exploitation of women. Establishing innocence might appeal to wavering supporters, but it is crucial to remember, as Chapkis says, that there are no guilty victims.
Voy a necesitar traducción, no es speaking English. Ella va a ser mi voz inglesa. Mi nombre es Hazel Girón. Vengo de una organización de Nicaragua, la Fundación Puntos de Encuentro.
My name is Hazel Hero. I come from Nicaragua, from an organization which works with points of contact of meeting.
Estamos trabajando actualmente a través de una estrategia de medios de comunicación el tema de la explotación sexual comercial.
At the moment we are working on a media strategy in terms of looking at this problem of sexual exploitation.
Y espero haber entendido globalmente la propuesta sobre campañas y estrategias que presentó la compañera.
I hope I've understood correctly all that has been said on the strategies for implementing campaigns on this issue.
Mi inquietud va que nosotras vemos vinculada a la explotación y la trata de personas, ¿verdad? Lo que ustedes llaman tráfico.
A worry for me is this link between exploitation and trafficking of women.
Vinculada a una cultura sexual donde se ve el cuerpo y se ve a la mujer como un objeto que se comercializa, sea negra, sea blanca, sea trigueña.
And we see this link to a culture of sex where the women's bodies are seen as an object for trade, regardless of whether that's a black body, a white body, whatever the color of the skin.
Y también en esta problemática se denota en mi país una tolerancia social extrema, una complacencia de todo el poder económico y político.
And a problem that's particularly prevalent in my country is that there seems to be a social amount of tolerance for the situation. People are happy to sit back and watch it happen, especially in the fields of the economic sector and political sector.
Para nosotras es relevante combatir la tolerancia social y además hacer conciencia y sensibilizar a la gente que esto es un delito.
It's very important for us that we fight this tolerant attitude in society on this subject and that we raise awareness in society that this is a crime.
Thanks for the intervention on choice. I was thinking what is actually really interesting in that sense is that the whole issue of choice is actually, when it comes to prostitutes, it's not even contemplated exactly because of the reasons that you were saying. Because they would, it's kind of they are seen as subjects that can actually not make the choice because they are in such a situation of violence or exploitation. So actually then discursively on the level of image that potential choice is even taken away in terms of how we see and conceive of women in the sex industry. And I think that's something for us to think about as well.
But absolutely, it's so important to be building awareness and raising awareness of sexual exploitation in all its forms. I think, as you say, that there's different ways to do campaigns and there's different ways to do media coverage. It's not something that campaigners or activists or NGOs necessarily have total control over because they have to work within, the sort of media and sort of PR systems that already exist, but there's a lot that can be done. I mean, I don't, like I said, just off the top of my head, one thing I would like to try, I think, is more campaigning that links the issue of trafficking for sexual exploitation to a wider social justice movement. And so looking more at exploitation and less at the sex, if you see what I mean. I think that it might be a way of attracting different groups of supporters to campaigns to sort of talk about labour rights more generally and see trafficking for sexual exploitation as part of that argument, although obviously it has its own separate specific issues.